Okay, so this week we're doing the problem of evil. This is a huge classical problem in theology, philosophy, and has all sorts of different uh, versions, iterations, qualities. It's not just a problem dealt by theists, but as I was chatting with some of your classmates before class, also the existentialists and moral philosophers generally. So the idea of the problem of evil, right, is as we're going to get into, is what is the target and subject of what we read today. William Rowe was an incredibly famous philosopher of religion who spent like his entire career doing philosophy of religion, and he's an atheist, right? So he forwards these atheist arguments. But what I really like about this paper is how respectful it is to both sides and how he carves out a conceptual space that is charitable to his interlocutor, his like enemy view. That the enemy is the wrong word, right? It's too negative, but like the view he's objecting to, which is theism. He carves out the conceptual space for it really charitably, and he does the same for his own. So he's not boosting himself up past the point of reason, nor is he breaking down the what he sees as the objectionable view to the point of being a straw man, right? So what I think is really cool about this paper, besides just like the fun arguing, and it's pretty clear, it's a pretty easy paper to get through, is the form of argument, and not just the form of argument, but also the form of expression, how the argument is given. Like this principle of charity is met, right? This is a really important thing when we're debating back and forth, especially about hot topic issues that like hit us really deeply, that we care about, like does God exist? That it's important to be respectful and charitable and to paint your interlocutor in the best light that you can. This is, I think, maybe like top three, if you had to reduce them down, top three most important lessons that you learn from doing philosophy as like taking it as an educational path, is how to treat alternative views as charitably as you can. And in doing so, you get a better idea and conception of your own view and where it fits into an objecting one. And what's cool about Rowe in his conclusion in this paper is he forwards this view of like friendly atheism, which he thinks is the most reasonable sort. And we get some interesting like epistemic arguments about how one can be justified in, like rationally justified in holding theistic beliefs at the same time that you can be rationally justified in holding atheistic beliefs, and how like any person who realizes this would have to sort of reconcile those two ideas. And there's a cool argument at the end that says it is possible to reconcile. So that's Rowe. Rowe is, yeah, I mean, that's his whole career. He spends his whole career as an atheist communicating with theologians and philosophers of religion alike, and batting the ball back and forth to forward these interesting arguments. So what we're going to do for today's lecture is dig into the problem of evil as presented by Rowe, and also as presented historically by a bunch of other saints and philosophers and theologians. But first, we're going to do a little bit of review just so we cover the same ground we did last week and make sure that we got it all sort of squared away so we understand what we're dealing with. Now, before we get started as well, the problem of evil is a problem for a specific conception of God and belief. So it's particularly acute with the Christian God, but the Christian God is the one who's triumphantly perfect, right? Who has this omnipotence, omniscience, and omnibenevolence, all good, all knowing, all powerful. This is the sort of being for whom the problem of evil is a particularly potent problem, okay? Now, there are other theistic conceptions, other pantheons, other conceptions of God, Rowe at the beginning of the paper distinguishes between like strong theism and weak theism. The strong theist is the one who's committed to a view of God as this like perfect being, and this is the sort of theist for whom the problem of evil is really problematic. So as we go through this lecture, keep that in mind, that that's where the arguments are targeted and where the commitments are targeted sort of from the other end. And if we shift around our deistic conceptions, we inevitably shift around how the arguments work and whether they work at all. So we're looking at this triune sort of perfect God. Okay, so last week we discussed the three different classical forms of proofs for God's existence. We proved God three ways. The first of these ways was the ontological proof, right? So God is that being than whom no greater can be conceived. It would be better if God existed in the mind or in reality and the mind than just the mind. Therefore, the greatest being that can be conceived must also exist in reality, right? And there are some classical objections to this. We have Guanillo or Guanillo, I don't know how it's pronounced, who argues that, look, why doesn't your proof for that being than whom no greater can be conceived also apply to anything else, right? That island was Guanillo's objection, that no greater can be conceived. Isn't it the perfect beach? Must that also exist? Or say the perfect cup of tea, right? The cup of tea greater than which no greater tea can be conceived. Does that also exist? And the response here, does anybody remember it? If we wanted to defend the ontological proof from this kind of objection, how we might do it? Good. So the defense here classically is God, island, cup of tea, whatever, name it what you will. The proof proves the maximally perfect being and no other. And so what you call an island, I call a cup of tea, and they call God, right? It doesn't really matter. It's the proof is about the most perfect, the ultimately at the end of perfection, that being, right? And so you wouldn't get a bunch of different beings that whom no greater can be conceived. You just get the being, right? Okay. We also could deny premise 2, right? This is Hume's objection. So we have a finite imagination. We can't conceptualize God. We can't actually conceive of that being than whom no greater can be conceived. It's not even an idea in our mind. As we discussed as well, Kant denies that existence is a predicate, which unsurprisingly is not an objection that I've ever had a student give. Right? Nobody says, "Oh, the objection to ontological proof is that existence isn't a predicate." It's a little strange, but it's at least an interesting argument. So the next form of proof that we got for God's existence was the cosmological proof, right? And we should recall that this proof doesn't really strictly prove God. Like, so the ontological proof gives us that triomniperfect, like strong theistic conception of God. The maximally perfect being. That's the one we think of when we think, of the classical stereotypical God. That's the archetype that sits in our mind. The cosmological proof, on the other hand, doesn't prove this kind of God, but is sort of helped, at least the classical strong theist God is aided by the cosmological proof. The cosmological proof tells us that all things that exist have a cause. The universe is a thing that exists, therefore it must have a cause. It can't have caused itself. Therefore, there must be some first cause of the universe. Something must have put everything here into motion, right? And if you are also a believer, how convenient, right? I already have all of this like written testament. And now I also have the principles of reason telling me that there must be some thing unlike the universe, some first mover who can create the universe. Let's mush them together. This is now a proof for God. Okay. Great. So ways to object to this argument is we could say that not all things must have a cause. We could say that the universe can have caused itself, or it could be this infinite causal regression, right? That the etiology of the cosmos is one that is infinite. And if we want to commit ourselves to some sort of infinite timeline, then this might be fine. Okay, we also talked about this difference between the God of the philosophers and the God of the theologians, right? So the distinction here, again, is that the God of the theologians is a personal God. It's one that is given to us in narrative, in scripture, in experience, is witnessed and evidenced through miracle, is the testament of faith. Whereas the God of the philosophers is something far more stripped down. It's a bare version of this God of the theologians. It is the end of argument rather than of testament, right? It is what reason commits us to. So a God of the theologians might be the sort of God that says, let there be light. But the God of the philosophers is that being than whom no greater can be conceived, right? Very different kinds of God that we get. Now, your classical historical proof givers of God's existence are religious people, right? Saint Anselm and Saint Augustine and Aquinas, right? All of these guys are in the tradition, but they sort of step out of their theological boots and into philosophical boots when they're giving these proofs, and then sort of see how the boots are the same size, the shoe fits, then the one meets the other, and why shouldn't they be so different? Then we discussed Paley, right? Does anybody remember Paley? Teleological proof, the proof for intelligent design. And who remembers why this one is different from the other two, like in form? Yeah. So what does that mean?
It's about probabilities, not chains of reasoning.
Good. So this proof does not give us deductively. Okay. Rolling back. Does anybody know the difference between a valid and a sound argument? I've mentioned this a couple of times, but not like in a sort of formally strict way. No? This is an important concept to have, that for logic, for philosophy, for everything, okay? So valid and sound arguments are deductive. The idea of a valid argument is in like a quippy punchline. If all of the premises are true, the conclusion must be true. So say, for instance, I have an argument, if it's raining, then the ground is wet. Premise, it's raining, therefore the ground is wet. If my premises are true, so for instance, if it's true that if it's raining, then the ground will be wet, and it's also true that it's raining, then I get the conclusion, I can't help but to, right? Both premises necessitate the fact of the conclusion. There's no way around it. So a valid argument is one for whom, if the premises are true, the conclusion must be true. When we are evaluating arguments at all, whether you're looking at them in, like the Guardian or the New Yorker or the New York Post, like whatever your news source is, your Facebook friends, whatever, if they're giving what's supposed to be an argument, this is the standard that it should meet, right? And again, like with respect to charitability, like be charitable, try and help them get to that point, or at least like read validity into the composition of the argument if it's possible. But this is the like standard of good argument. Is it valid, right? Soundness is a valid argument for whom all the premises are also true, okay? So the ontological proof for God's existence is a valid proof. If all of the premises were true, then the conclusion must also be true. But what we did in objecting to all of these different premises, right, is showing why we might think different premises are false, or why we think that the rules of inference between premises don't hold, or whatever, right? So what we're doing is either showing that the valid argument is not sound, or that if we reinterpret the way the argument is supposed to be, like is better off constructed, then we get an invalid proof, right? So in inductive logic, as opposed to deductive, we don't get valid or sound arguments. We don't get necessitation of a conclusion given the truth of the premises. What we get is a matter of correlation, and strength of correlation, right? That we're doing an induction. We're saying, look, given all of the evidence, it's this much likely that. Okay, so the teleological proof, insofar as it is an inductive proof, is not one for whom if all the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. No, it's using evidence and analogy to draw together a degree of belief or of probability for its conclusion. And as Paley says, look, if the objects of nature are like human artifacts and human artifacts are designed, then nature is probably also designed. It's not a necessitated conclusion, but it's a probable one, right? If we're to believe the analogies hold and that the construction of the inductive proof is done well. Hume does not think it's done well. Hume says, look, human artifacts are nothing like natural ones. Natural objects don't operate at all like watches, so drawing that analogy is absurd, Paley. And so you can, break down the inductive power, the correlative power of your like purported evidence to being indicative of a conclusion by saying, look, it's not actually evidence for what you're saying it's evidence for. Okay, so these are our proofs for God's existence, the classical proofs. The problem of evil is what we'll look at next. Okay, so these are two incredibly famous scenes from the Bible, Old Testament Bible. Does anybody know them? Does anybody recognize these? No? Not even a guess?
Is that where he's sacrificing his son?
Yeah. It's the binding of Isaac, Abraham and Isaac. So Abraham in Genesis is like God. So there's like a bunch of gods at the beginning, or like a bunch of different beliefs, but there's like one true God. And Abraham is the son of whomever who leaves his family and his birthright to follow the one true God. And he ends up making a covenant with the one true God. And in this covenant, after like 80 or 100 years of believing in God and communing with him, God says, okay, like you can have a kid finally, right? And it's been 100 years that he and his wife have traveled the earth from Egypt to like the cradle of Israeli and the Israelite civilization, the Syria and Babylonia. He's traveling all over the world. And after 100 years, God finally says, all right, you can have a kid. And so gives him a trueborn son in Isaac. But God isn't done goofing with Abraham here, covenant or not. Isaac, I don't know, must be like 7 or 8 or something. I think it's 8 years after this happens. God sends, I think, an angel to Abraham. It is an angel. And the angel says, look, Abraham, God wants you to take Isaac, your only trueborn and most beloved son, the person in the world that you love more than anything. Take him up to Mount Moriah, Sinai, something like that. Sacrifice him. And Abraham takes like 3 days to go to this mountain. He sort of drags his feet, and the whole time silence, right, between he and his son. He takes another day to walk up the mountain, knowing what's to come. He's left his wife behind. He's left his 2 servants behind. It's just he and Isaac alone walking up this mountain. Isaac doesn't know what's wrong, but can certainly sense that there's trouble. So they get to the top, and Abraham binds Isaac's hands and his feet and places him on an altar of stone, picks up the knife and raises it above the chest of his young son, his only son. He has a bastard son, but was kicked out and was like his trueborn son. So raises the blade above the breast of this young boy. And in this moment where in complete conviction, he's ready to sacrifice Isaac, he's ready to bring the blade down. In that moment where you decide that this is what will be, but have yet to let the action occur, the angel reappears, says, whoa, hold on. Why don't you just stay your hand real quick and look in that bush? You see that lamb that's caught in the brambles? You can kill that instead, right? So what we see, this is a Caravaggio painting on what would be your left, right? Is this moment where Abraham is confronted. The lamb appears in the brambles, and the angel says, whoa, whoa, whoa. It's like grabbing his hand, right? Staying the hand of the blade that will kill his trueborn son, to really, in effect, like break the covenant with God. But he's doing it because he has complete faith, right? But look at what, at least like as Caravaggio represents it, what pain and struggle this complete faith costs Abraham, even in this moment of being saved. Look at the pain in his eyes, how concerned he is to be stopped after this like critical moment of decision. In the critical moment of decision, there is only suffering in this moment. There is faith. There is the power of the covenant being respected, being proven true. The power of God revealing and saving, staying the hand of Abraham that would be forever bloodied and black by the terrible deed that he was about to perform. But likewise, at the same time, he was ready to perform it. And so what do we see is a representation of the problem of evil here. Is the fact of the pain and suffering, the terrible deeds that can be done, that we are capable of as humans, and that may even be decreed by God, and what sort of terror and pain and suffering that can cause us. That breakdown between this utopic vision, this beatific vision, which didn't really exist until Christianity comes around, and the reality of our world clashing, colliding, coming together. And we see the pain of the problem in Abraham's eyes here. Does anybody know the second picture? Yeah, it's Job. So Job is another interesting Old Testament story. And the reason that I pick these two is that they're biblical, and their purpose and their place in the Bible is, I think, objection to the problem of evil. This is how I like my own personal interpretation of the story. That what we get is a representation of the problem of evil in the action of these like most beloved servants of God, and then the reification of faith as the redeeming power through the mystery that is the all-powerful one true God, right? But there's like these alternative conceptions, right, where you get a whole lot of what doesn't really feel so great from the perspective of the man, Job, or the man, Abraham. And then alternatively, you flip it around and prophet, or like divinely inspired like being, Abraham, father of nations, or Job, most wonderful believer there ever was. You get this like power of the story of faith. So interesting, sort of like you get the same, equally opposite perspectives, flip side of the coin. So the story of Job, just to sort of fill out the lecture, the way that Job lives his life is he's I want to say Job is like well after Abraham. Job is like God's most beloved follower. He believes in God more than anybody, and God is really stoked on this. So he like gives Job a big old family and a whole lot of land, and Job's cattle are, they reproduce a lot, and I don't know, make all sorts of milk, or he makes a lot of money from his livestock. And one day, for whatever reason, Satan taps God on the shoulder and says, yo, I bet you that I can make this guy, your best guy, your number one dude. I bet I can make that person, Job, stop believing in you. I bet I can make him forsake you. And God says, yeah, sure, just don't kill him. Okay. So Satan says, great, goes down to Job and commits him to a series of trials. So the first of these trials is there's a plague upon his livestock, completely destroying his livelihood. But he's still got his big old villa. He's still got his family. And so every night at dinner, he prays to God, bless the Lord for these like gifts, right? So Satan says, darn it, it wasn't enough. So while Job is away one evening, trying to like secure some business deal or whatever, Satan blows up his house while his whole family's inside, his wife and his like 18 kids or whatever, crushed to death, done. Job comes home and sees this awful tragedy, wails in sorrow, and then, praises God, says, please take care of their souls. The devil, Satan, shoot. Not yet either. Well, that it was worse way back then. So now Job is homeless, without money. His family is in bloody ruins under the rubble of his home. And so Satan says, all right, the only thing you got left is you. So he casts Job out into the desert just to wander. His clothes are worn away. So Job is naked in rags, as we see here. And, just to top it all off, he gives him boils, right? So now it's like plague sores all over him. His body is decrepit and ruined. This most beloved follower of the one true God, who was given so much favor, is now reduced to what we see here, who just is the emblem of suffering, right? All that he loves, all that he was, all that he had, all that he is destroyed. And there he is. He falls to his knees in the middle of the desert. And instead of this time, praising God or praying at all, wishing well through, his works, Job does something different this time. He falls to his knees and he says, why? And this moment is so cool. Because again, like the flip side of the coin, right? There's a breakdown, but it's not a complete breakdown. It's not a like, screw you or where are you? It's a why. Like he's talking right at God. He never forsakes him, never gives him up, but is no longer like, doesn't trust him or is lost. It's some sort of in between of like with faith and without faith, that it took losing everything to get to. And in this moment, after the silence that, in every tragedy, God responds with silence, and Satan with worse tragedy, God responds. And the answer is this long diatribe that basically says, I'm the most powerful thing, I am God. And that's the answer. And this is supposed to be, again, like a reification of faith, that in this moment of complete awful suffering, that the response, there is a response at all. And the response is just that you are human and I am God. Only I have my reasons, and that's enough. And for Job, it is enough. And Job's faith is restored. And along with Job's faith, God's favor in Job. So God gives him another villa and another family and like heals all the sores. And so he just gets sort of like family and livestock 2.0. And then everybody lives happily ever after, except for the first family who's still crushed in the bloody rubble. So these are the biblical representations of the problem of evil in the Old Testament. And the the response to these representations of the problem, which I'll define shortly. So like, I haven't like said exactly what it is, but sort of giving you the feeling of it first before we go into like the concept of it. The biblical response in the Old Testament is that God is beyond reason, and that through God all things are possible. Through God it is possible to will the death of your son and also to believe and be saved, right? Through God it is possible to enter that in-between state of faith and still be like the best believer. And there's this mystery, this breakdown of reason and action, of salvation and suffering. And that is enough to like reify faith. Now, as this tradition is interpreted and brought up as problematic throughout the ages, throughout the history of philosophy and theology, it takes on all sorts of new forms. And theologians, philosophers of religion, early thinkers, saints, and the like are often dissatisfied, and so offer their own new conceptions, which we'll be looking at more as we go forward. So if you're looking for these, there you go. The artists, that is. Okay, so the problem of evil. God is all good. Therefore, God will always choose the morally superior choice. God is all powerful. Therefore, God always can choose that. He's not restricted in any way. God's all knowing. God always knows the best choice to choose. This is our tri-omniperfect conception of God. So this is, again, Leibniz. We saw his beautiful wig and wonderful face last week. So Leibniz says, therefore, God created the best of all possible worlds. God knows all of the possibilities that there are, omniscient. God has the power to actualize any of them, omnipotent. And God is all good, so he'll choose the best of them. And Leibniz has some interesting arguments as well, where he says, look, if there weren't a best of all possibles, then God would choose not to actualize any world. And so the fact of this one existing is evidence of it being the best, given the properties of God. Interesting arguments there. However, we have in Leibniz's happy argument that God created the best of all possible worlds, we have some detractors in Hume, who is a detractor in just about everything, turns out, and Epicurus here. So Epicurus is a Roman philosopher. The idea is, if God is willing but not able, then he is not omnipotent. If he is able but not willing, then he is malevolent. If he is both willing and able, then whence cometh evil? Okay, so this is like the classic Epicurean format of the problem of evil. Willing to do what? Well, stop evil. We live in a world where it's possible to have your family crushed by a house, to watch your sons and daughters go off to war for awful reasons and be like torn and ripped apart by barbarous people. We live in a world where evil, bad stuff happens. Okay, so if God is willing to stop this evil, but not able, then he lacks omnipotence. But if God is able, but not willing, then he's not all good, right? Or so it would seem. And if he's both willing and able, then how do we make sense of the evil in this world? And this is the problem of evil, right? How do we reconcile the existence of this tri-omniperfect God with the coexistence of evil as we interpret it in our lived world, our day-to-day experience? So the way that we reconcile this historically is called theodicy. There were all sorts of theodicies before Leibniz, but Leibniz is the guy who like coins the term theodicy. He published like 2 books, and like the main book that he publishes is called Theodicy. And his theodicy is, well, I'm committed to this tri-omniperfect God, therefore God created the best of all possible worlds. So theodicy is a story that we tell about suffering or evil as it exists, and God in order to make their coexistence possible. We reconcile these two concepts together with a theodicy, with a story, right, an argument. So in theodicy, he argues that by the logic of the necessary qualities of God, that is like the omnipotence, omnibenevolence, omniscience, it must be the case that this is the best of all possible worlds. Does anybody want to try to object to this argument that this is the best of all possible worlds? Yeah. Sorry? Good. If he could do anything, why wouldn't he make a better world? So the idea here is, look, maybe I accidentally step on my cat's tail. Don't, no, Jesus, right? Like, just, it's bad. I didn't mean to, but it's like some amount of suffering and harm. I can imagine a world in which I stepped like 6 inches to the right and my cat wasn't yelping and running off, right? Why didn't God make that world? Right? Good. So famously, we get the objection to Leibniz in satire from Voltaire's Candide. So in Candide, there's a character who believes that, you know, like this is the best of all possible worlds, and there's a bunch of other characters that sort of exemplify different Leibnizian characters, and the whole book is just like a satirization of this idea, inspired by this awful earthquake that I think I have written here. Yeah, that occurs in Lisbon during Voltaire's life, and it killed like thousands of people. It was this terrible tragedy. And Voltaire says, like, what the hell, Leibniz? You can say that this is the best of all possible worlds, the one where thousands of people die in this awful earthquake. Couldn't we have lived in the same world but without the earthquake, right? So Candide just completely satirizes and makes exactly this move. That isn't there just another near possible world, and why does this one have to be the best? It's a theodicy, but it's a pretty simple one. It's a pretty stripped down one. It isn't terribly intricate. It just says, look, God is that sort of thing, therefore this must be it. I don't know what to say about the things we think are evil, but this is the best. So if that's unsatisfying, which to many it is, you know, like obviously there's a whole like incredibly famous book about it, and the book is like that small. If you read Leibniz ever, I recommend Candide, it's pretty funny. This is Irenaeus, who is a Roman saint, theologian, like super early Christian, basically. I think he's like operating in, I want to say like 400 AD. So he's like second generation Christian, right? Like the first generation Christians didn't write anything down because they all thought the world was going to end. And this is why the Gospels are written like it's only Mark, like the other one, Luke. No, Luke is the Matthew. Yeah, Mark and Matthew that are like the early ones, right? That they're called like the Logia. I don't know, Greek word. And these are the traditions that are supposed to be like they're super dry, and they were supposed to be like told by people who knew people around Jesus's time. And then you get Luke and John, which are much richer and much more aimed at objecting to Roman political ideas, and were probably very much apocryphal, though, you know, still contains the stories, but like embellishes in order to build sort of this new Christian image. Irenaeus is like third generation. So after like Christianity kind of taken hold in the Roman world, there's, you know, like a whole lot of writing and a whole lot of philosophizing and thinking about the issues of the church and its place and, you know, God and stuff. Irenaeus considers the problem of evil. Says, okay, so evil exists. How do we make sense of this? So what he concludes is that in order for there to be good, there must also be evil for the true heart to prove their souls, says Irenaeus. So argument. One becomes good by diminishing suffering. To be in the likeness of God is to be maximally good. To be maximally good, one must maximally diminish suffering. This is the project of God. However, if there were no suffering in the world, people could not diminish it. There'd be nothing to overcome. There'd be nothing to do. There'd be no soul making. There'd be no challenges to make us better off, right? To like whatever doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Really just makes you weaker and more tired. But in the soul making theodicy, you have to have some sort of evil to overcome in order to be good. Therefore, suffering exists in order to make becoming good possible. Does anybody want to object? What do we think? Yeah.
Like if a baby dies, they don't have enough time. Get rid of it.
Yeah. So if a baby dies, they don't have enough time to get rid of evil. Yeah. I don't. So I read the catechism, but like a decade ago. So I don't know like what the whole perspective on infants is. I know that in Dante's fanfic of Christianity, that I think they go to like purgatory and their souls just kind of float around for a while and then they eventually get up to heaven. I want to say that the Pope's take, and I could be completely wrong, but I want to say that the Pope's take is something like the innocent soul, the baby soul, just like goes straight up if it dies. So that, you know, that there are other stories that are told about infants and children, and if there weren't such stories, then yeah, that would be an issue. So you might say like, well, do all children who die young like just get screwed over? Is that game over for them? It's just burn in eternal hell and suffering because they didn't grow up enough? That seems unfair, right? So good. Anybody else? Yeah.
There's also, you can also do good by increasing happiness.
Good. Yeah, so you might say that, well, this is kind of a bleak view. The only, becoming good is overcoming evil. Can't we just like have a positive project of producing good as well? And then why should there be evil if happiness and joy and compassion and love and stuff can all be self-compounded? Why must there be suffering if we can make what's already good more good? Good. Yeah.
How does like genocide make it good? Doesn't make the people who die better. It doesn't make the people who live better.
How does genocide make anybody better? Yeah. So this is a good objection. So you could say like, look, Irenaeus, you're right. Let's get committed to this soul-making theodicy. Does there really need to be that much evil? Right? So the objection is like genocide is a big amount of evil. Couldn't there just be like a little bit less? Like, do we need like total genocide? Like, what if just a few people die here and there? Is that enough? What if there's just one big bad, like Sauron and the orcs and everybody else is kind of, we can agree that that dude wearing all black and covered in fire and laughing with a very deep voice, like that's the bad guy. Isn't that enough, right? Does there also need to be, like mass murder and the death of young infants and stuff? So like how much evil is enough? And for Irenaeus and likely for Leibniz as well, the response would be to bite the bullet, right? Would be to say whatever there is in this world, that is what's enough. So there's this concept in political philosophy from Rawls. I think Rawls comes up with it, but it might be around. It's like really operative and famous through Rawls. So the idea is maximin, where what you want to do in a society in order to achieve fairness, like a distribution of power and wealth that's fair, is to maximin. So what you do is you give the the bottom tier of society as much resources as you possibly can. So you make the lowest common denominator as high as you possibly can, right? So same idea with the soul-making theodicy. If you are Arrhenius or Leibniz, you're probably committed to a view of the best possible world being the one that maximizes suffering, the one that maximizes the amount of good and minimizes the amount of harm, and does so by being committed to this idea that like whatever there is in the world is just that, you know, the least amount of harm that's necessary in order to produce the most amount of like, you know, walking in the path of God people or good people, right? Does anybody else want to take a stab before we move on? Yeah, Jason.
Premise one, I think you could argue that some suffering can't be diminished. And that seems like then this argument wouldn't really explain that kind of suffering.
Good. Do you have an example in mind?
Like if you get a chronic health disorder that there's just no cure for, and you're going to live for 50 years, but you're going to be miserable the whole time.
Yeah, good. So we might say that there are kinds of suffering that can't be overcome. So say you like have a, so I'll make the example a little more egregious because I think like if you have a chronic illness or whatever, like say you're deaf, you know, like your other senses are excelled, that there's a way to like talk around this kind of problem.
Yeah.
Unless we make it really clear what the issue is. So say you have like a screaming pain that completely shuts off, it makes your animal brain that like that's all that can happen is just like your mind goes, you know, it just is in complete total suffering. And then I don't know, maybe you're like hooked up to a machine or something that keeps you, so you don't have to eat, you just feel pain and that's like your existence. There might be this kind of suffering, and this is like a toy example, kind of an absurd one, but we can imagine cases where it's a little less absurd and the suffering isn't overcome or couldn't be because it's just too much or whatever. But the idea is that, look, there are just kinds of suffering that are too great, just slightly too much that we can't overdo and nobody could help us with. They happen, that suffering happens in isolation of the capacity to soul make it, to make it better, to redeem it. So yeah, this is a good objection. Nietzsche would argue there's no such kind of suffering. All suffering is redeemable. Okay, anybody else?
My rebuttal to that question is the what kind of suffering is it something that like you brought upon yourself or something that you were born with, or I guess like in your question?
I'm not sure, and I don't know if that would matter either way. What the source was.
I would argue the distinction
Oops.
between either of those is extremely valuable, whether it's something you're born with that you can't help, or you have an innate characteristic brought upon by your own doing.
Why is that?
As far as like the moment like when you ask that, like the first thing that came to mind was like, oh, AIDS uncurable. Like, are you born with that, or is that something that you did on your own? Or
It can happen both ways.
yeah, for like cancer, it's like, you know, were you born with cancer, or did you get lung cancer because you smoked a pack of cigarettes every day for 30 years?
Yeah, so in the one case, and this is sort of what I'm getting at, there might be cases of suffering, like say you're like born with HIV and then it becomes it's like a small child. You're not responsible for it and you couldn't overcome, and maybe, you know, like you're a foster child or something, and there's nobody there to like help you or make it better. You just kind of suffer and die. That seems like a kind of suffering that didn't need to happen in the first place, which would be an objection to this. But yeah, in the alternative case where we want to say like there's some sort of moral responsibility involved, some sort of choice, then you could have chosen alternatively and made better rather than made worse. Good. Okay. So we have Leibniz's theodicy that logically speaking, this is just the best of all possible worlds. And now we also have a soul-making theodicy. Each have issues, right? As all arguments will have issues. The goal is to like work through them to make them better. So here's the evidential problem of evil. This is William Rowe's big contribution, his like career moment. So the evidential problem of evil, as opposed to the logical problem of evil, which we looked at earlier, the logical problem of evil is there's evil in the world and God is trying to be perfect. These are logically incompatible. I know that suffering exists. I don't have any other evidence besides Testament that God exists. So the strength of this evidence breaks this. The evidential problem of evil isn't going to be a deductive argument that there's a logical incompatibility, but it's going to do the kind of inductive strength of evidence thing. So it aims to show that even if the existence of evil and God are consistent, their coexistence is not likely. Okay, so we can tell all the theodicies we want, but what are we talking about in terms of probabilities, right? Are we, more likely to live in a world that has evil and God exists, but with some soul-making stuff going on, or is it more likely that God doesn't? So 1, there exists instances of intense suffering which an omnipotent, omniscient being could have prevented without thereby losing some greater good or permitting some evil equally bad or worse. This is the argument from gratuitous evil. So think the case of like child being born with HIV, and why not, what the hell, throw on a congenital heart condition as well, and they like suffer and die way young. This didn't need to happen. Evil is so terrible that like nothing could ever make it better. I don't want to get too horrific, but we can all sort of imagine cases we can extrapolate to, not just like, oh, isn't it kind of sad that this bad stuff happened, but this is so absolutely terrible that it's horrific and unforgivable and nothing could ever make it better. There are evils in the world like this. We live in a pretty awful place sometimes. So gratuitous evil, definition, is the sort of evil that we do not like to imagine, though can, unfortunately, and can also imagine not existing, and the world not being so radically different than it is now, except that the terrible act wouldn't have occurred. Okay, so step 2 is to say an omniscient, wholly good being would prevent the occurrence of any intense suffering if it could, unless it could not do so, without thereby losing some greater good or permitting some evil equally bad or worse. Therefore, there does not exist an omnipotent, omniscient, wholly good being. This is the argument from gratuitous evil. Does anybody want to try to object to this? Among exponents? Huh? Yeah, sure. Yeah. How about online responses to the gratuitous problem of evil? Okay, well, one way of dealing with this is St. Augustine ripping the Holy Spirit from his dome. It's pretty cool. And it looks like a heart that's on fire. Also super cool. St. Augustine, total badass. But anyways, he gives, I think he was at like the Third Council of Nicaea, where the like Catholics early on like decide what counts as a heresy and what the Bible should consist in, like which books, because there's a whole bunch of different like sects of Christianity at this time, and they all accept different gospels. And so they have these councils where like all of the big Christian minds come together and they say, now this is the story, right? And so now we have like the Apocrypha, which are gospels that weren't voted in. It's this big like political back and forth, as well as a super interesting historical moment where Christianity like reunifies itself after this diaspora of belief. Super cool, worth looking into. Anyways,
Ethiopian Christian community, they involved the Apocrypha, and Book of Enoch, and everything in their Bible.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, so if you're interested in the Apocrypha as stories surrounding the canonical Bible, the Septuagint is the book to pick up and read through. Okay, so Augustine gives us a free will theodicy. So what the evidential problem of evil is doing is saying, like, look, the fact of this kind of evil, this gratuitous evil, makes it really unlikely that even if like God could exist, that God would, because any sort of being that had any sort of power to stop that terrible kind of evil would, unless it were not in God's power to, and unless God isn't responsible for that kind of evil at all, which is what we get in the free will theodicy. So evil is the misuse of free will in failing to promote goodness. Okay, so this is like our intuition here. So 1, the problem of evil is only a problem because God is made out to be responsible for evil. That a morally perfect being cannot also at the same time be responsible for doing awful stuff, right? So you wouldn't call someone perfect and all good if they followed you around and flicked you in the back of the head every 30 seconds. You would say, dang it, stop. That's irritating, right? This person would not be all good. Similar to God, we wouldn't call God omnibenevolent if it were the case that God were also responsible for us being flicked in the back of the head every 30 seconds. That'd be kind of frustrating, right? So the problem of evil is only a problem if that evil is causally related to God. However, God caused humans to have free will. We choose to do what we will in the world, or not. Free will is good. The expression of our will, our capacity to be authentic, genuine beings, to act in the likeness of God ourselves, to make these covenants, it's always a choice. And this choice is what sanctifies faith and the covenant itself with God, right? So conclusion 1, God is responsible for a good thing. God gave us free will. Awesome. You did great, right? Argument 2. 1, the exercise of free will can cause there to be more good or less goodness in the world. Meaning I can choose to flick you in the back of the head every 30 seconds, or I can choose to not flick you in the back of the head every 30 seconds, okay? 2, evil is a privation or a lack of goodness. This is a Socratic idea. Socrates argued through, like Plato argued through the mouthpiece of Socrates, that there's no such thing as evil and there's no such thing as bad people. We remember the Apology, right? That nobody would willfully harm the people around them because that'll harm themselves, right? This is all part of like a moral story, the Socratic morality, which is that nobody wants to do evil at all because we all want what's best for us, for ourselves, me and mine. And so we're all trying to be the best that we can possibly be. It's just that some of us are more ignorant than others. So some of us understand what the good is, like capital T, capital G, less than others. And because we are more ignorant, we have less of a complete understanding of the good. When we try to do good, we screw up, right? We make mistakes. And so evil is a privation of goodness in this sort of way, that we're all trying to do our best to do well, but we could have done much better in cases that we say, well, that was evil, that sucks, right? So evil is a lack of goodness. It's not like a commitment to some alternative moral paradigm in which there are good things and there are bad things, and these are predicates and properties of two very different types of acts. No, there's just good things, and then there's more and less. And when there's very little good, we call that evil. And when there's a whole lot of good, we call that, hey, that was awesome. Well done. Okay. So 3, the privation of goodness is caused by the misuse of free will, right? I'm freely choosing to flick you in the back of the head. I'm misusing my free will. I should spend my time doing more productive, better things. At least according to you. God is not responsible for the misuse of free will because otherwise it wouldn't be free, right? So conclusion 2, God is not responsible for the privation of goodness and therefore not responsible for evil.
Lots of suffering isn't caused by humans at all.
Ah, good. Lots of suffering isn't caused by humans at all. You've preempted the next slide. Natural evil. So we have gratuitous evil as sort of like a part of the evidential problem, making the existence of God, the coexistence of God and evil less likely. We also have from Rowe, and we get that in this paper that we read for today, the idea of natural evil. We can imagine a fawn in a forest well before any humans existed, and a spark is lit in that forest by a strike of lightning. The forest catches on fire and surrounds this fawn and eventually chokes it out and it burns to death. This is natural evil. Wouldn't it be a little bit better if, you know, Bambi didn't burn to death in the woods? Right? Just a little bit. Like, Bambi's cute, and Bambi doesn't deserve to die that way, especially Bambi's mom. But hey, even after Bambi's mom, Bambi goes that way too. It's, different story. So yeah, natural evil, right? We might say that there is caused by humans, and maybe God's not responsible for that, given the free will theodicy. But what about all the other stuff? Natural evil. Bambi burning in a forest, not so great. Good, yeah.
But are natural causes like inherently evil?
Good, yeah. So this is the response. So if you are Augustine and you hear of you hear Sylvie say, well, you know, Bambi got burned up in them woods, not cool, God. Say, well, you know, it's not really evil. It's just nature. You know, it happens. It sort of sucks. Evil and as the privation of goodness is really only the sort of thing that happens with humans. And so when we talk about fawns burning in woods, our moral conceptions don't really apply. This is a good response, right? A good rebuttal. Do you want to try to follow up? Just like, you know, is your intuition saying like what you would respond to that with?
Yeah, well, it's still causing suffering, which brings us back to the original problem.
Yeah, because animals suffer, right? Or maybe they don't. You know, maybe they're all just like robotic automata that have no feelings, that only represent what looks like pain and sounds like screaming agony, but is really just, you know, like, you know, you hit your knee and it kicks, right? Maybe animal minds are like that. They're not, but maybe they're like that. They're not. But maybe they're right. So yeah, you could say like, look, suffering is the issue. And again, distinguish between like human suffering and non-human suffering.
Humans can be suffering until forest fire too, and die from natural evil.
Yeah. Okay, good. Yeah.
I guess is suffering in itself evil?
Yeah. So what Augustine is doing with this evil is the privation of goodness is working around exactly this issue. So is evil suffering? Is suffering evil, right? If you're Buddha, then heck yeah, it is, right? Everything is suffering. So let's escape it together.
But if you're at the
Follow
gym
the Eightfold
working out,
Path.
you're suffering.
What?
I said, but if you're like at the gym working out and you're suffering, your muscles are suffering, you're in pain. and it's only-
Yeah. So yeah, like if you're at the gym working out, you're in pain, and you might say you're suffering, especially on leg day. So what Augustine does is he completely operates around the problem of suffering by locating evil in a privation of goodness rather than in suffering and like pain and in harm. So the idea of suffering turns out to be a non-issue for Augustine. So because it just isn't connected to evil. It might be a feature or a fact of the world that we might consider more and less fortunate, probably more often than not less fortunate. But say like in the case of working out, more fortunate, or neutrally, whatever, however much you like leg day, that's how much fortunate you get. But the idea of evil as a privation of goodness is to like circumnavigate the issue of suffering as a source of evil. So this might be like a weirdness. You might say, no, suffering is evil. It's not good. Like suffering and evil go hand in hand. What do you got to say about that, Augustine? And he would look at you and say, well, we're just speaking different languages, right? And sometimes that's how it is, right? If you reveal to one another in an argument that you share at bottom incontrovertible but differing intuitions, then the best that we can do is respect one another for these intuitions, right? That we can say like, look, I get it. I see where you're coming from. And I understand why your belief, which follows from these intuitions, is rational insofar as that there is a chain of giving and ask. There's the project of giving and asking reasons that follow from this sort of like bedrock of intuition. And the world sort of accords with the intuition. Well, so you're not like, you know, I intuit that my skin is purple. No, right? Like you have your brain is working right. And ultimately, this is what Rowe in the paper comes to conclude with respect to like theists versus atheists, right? Is that they can get to this point. So similarly, if you think that evil is a kind of suffering or evil is a kind of privation of good, you might say, yeah, we just mean different things by evil. And so we can respect one another's arguments and conclusions, but we won't be able to go much further than that. These are actually kind of beautiful moments in philosophical discourse and argument in general. So often like Facebook and with parents and stuff, you know, like friends, even family members at Thanksgiving prepare for this. Things get heated and we get invested and we get emotional and we become dogmatic and tenacious in our positions because they matter to us, not because they're actually valuable or worthy or that we like have the capacity to express them well. And then the argument devolves into this like battle of wills rather than a battle of reasons and a battle of intuitions and conceptions. And where the battle of wills will end in a conclusion that feels good or bad, there's a winner and a loser, and the winner feels like, you know, bad, and the winner feels, hey, great, like so powerful. When the debate is one of reasons, giving and asking and offering, the winner is the one who comes to know their reasons that much better, right? It's the one who comes to understand the reasons of their interlocutor that much clearer. And so it doesn't matter like who's right or wrong in these debates. It just matters like how well you're associated with your position. And no position is worth so much pain as, you know, like family arguments and stuff, Thanksgiving. So don't be so dogmatic and tenacious when you go home. Be a little compassionate, you know. Okay. So here's one that I think is really fun, is divine risk. So here's God playing poker. If God kind of played some poker with Job, you know, like Satan said, I bet I can make him not believe in you. And God said, all right, take that bet. Is this the kind of God, is this sort of risk-taking consistent with a triumphant perfect God? There's a whole bunch of, this is like a whole subfield of philosophy of religion. It's a really interesting one. There's all sorts of really neat papers that have to do with like epistemology, like what God could know or does know, and how like a bet would work for an omniscient being. So you get like all sorts of really fun conceptions of knowledge and epistemology and like counterfactual knowledge from Molina, and like what you would know if this were the case, or you know, hypothetical knowledge. But here's the idea, right? Is there is so God can choose to create the best of all possible worlds, and that is the one in which free will exists, right? But as soon as God creates it, God isn't in control anymore. It's the beings with free will that are in control. And you might say there's a 0.8 probability, 80% chance that world that's the best of all possible worlds, it, you know, like overcomes its evil and reaches utopia and it's all good. But there's a 20% chance that you get dealt an unsuited 7 and 3, right? That's not good if you don't play, but you don't want, and it's the worst hand. So is it possible for a God who knows, who's omniscient, omnibenevolent, and omnipotent, to take risks like this? So in creating a world with freedom, in no longer controlling that world, because freedom would not be what it is if everything were written and determined, right? Could the perfect God that we're imagining, this triune perfect God, be the creator of such a world? Is God the sort of being that can take risks? Interesting question, right? Any intuition? Can God take risks or not?
Well, if God is all knowing, then he should know all the possible futures.
Good. So if God is all knowing, God should know all the possible futures. So I mentioned counterfactual knowledge. We'll go into this in just a sec. Give you like a taste of it. So is free will possible if God is omniscient? No. Yeah, good. So this is the intuition, right? That if God knows all of the possible futures, then they're all written. And we live in one of them, right? We live in one of these possible worlds, and God knows everything that is gonna happen, right? So here's the move by this, I think he's Franciscan, might have been a Jesuit, I don't know. This monk, Molina, from Spain, maybe Portugal, I think Spain, way back when. Molina develops this idea of divine counterfactual knowledge, where you can make free will consistent with omniscience, if it's the case that God doesn't have like explicit direct knowledge, but counterfactual knowledge, meaning that like a counterfactual is, if I were to talk about rainbows, then you would be confused in the context of this lecture, right? That's a counterfactual. It's to say that if a particular condition is met, then this will be the consequence, right? But it's not to say that I'm going to talk about rainbows and you're going to be confused about this in the context of the class, right? It's a counterfactual because it's a hypothetical. It's sort of put out into theoretical space. So what Molina argues is that God's omniscience is counterfactual. It's knowledge like that. It's hypothetical knowledge. So what God knows is sort of like there's not one single path through which the world is written, and that's the way it must be. But you might imagine it like a dotted line and like a tree sort of branching out, and that God knows that if you were to choose this over that, then this is what would happen. Or if you were to choose the alternative, then that's what would happen. And so the omniscience becomes counterfactual omniscience rather than like direct, this is what will occur. And this is dealt with in contemporary philosophy, like Plantinga, who I mentioned last time. It gives the modal S5 proof for God's existence. But yeah, it's a really interesting back and forth, like the consistency of free will with God's omniscience. And if you took like a philosophy religion class, or like went to divinity school or whatever, you would study Molina almost certainly. I want to say that Peterson in his philosophy of religion class covers Molina, although I'm not certain. But it's a totally fascinating issue. I mean, it's one worth dealing with in just an epistemology class outright, like the idea of counterfactual knowledge at all. Anyways, soapbox. Anybody else want to try to object to this theodicy, the free will theodicy from Augustine, before we move on?
And the only thing I'd say is it relies on free will. So.
Yeah, it relies on free will. So if you're a determinist, or if you think free will is incompatible no matter what with omniscience, then sorry, Augustine. Yeah, right. So you have to stipulate freedom of will in order to get the argument to run at all. Okay. So now we have three theodicies. We have our very simple, this just logic commits us to this being the best of all possible worlds. We have a soul-making theodicy that good is the goodness is the overcoming of evil. And now we have a free will theodicy that tells us that, look, freedom is the ultimate good. And insofar as freedom is maximally created in this world, then God did all that God could possibly do in creating the best of all possible worlds. And if there's any evil, it's not his fault, it's our fault, right? Okay. But we also have the logical problem of evil, right? That if a triomni perfect being exists, then evil cannot, but there's evil in the world. Therefore, by modus tollens, that God doesn't exist. We have the evidential problem of evil, which says the evidential problem of evil is that the existence of gratuitous evil makes it really unlikely that that kind of God would exist. Because if that God did exist, even if it were consistent with evil, it probably wouldn't be consistent with gratuitous evil. It wouldn't want that to be at all, probably, right? This is like the evidential induction. We also just have in general the existence of gratuitous evil, the existence of natural evil, the idea of divine risk in free will. The arguments are stacking up against the theists. What's the next move, right? So we can give all sorts of theodicies, but all of them are going to run into some kind of trouble or another. As will any argument within the boundaries of reason. And Rowe, another like sort of point that I really liked about the paper that we read for today, that he mentions is like, look, that not all theists are going to be satisfied with the proofs from reason or the rational conception of theology. Many of them are, or are at least interested in making consistent the properties and powers of reason with theological conceptions. But not everybody's going to be totally convinced or even happy with the idea that there are rational conceptions that can ground belief and faith, that they're just sort of like incongruous belief forming epistemic powers that we have. And so any amount of reason you have won't satisfy belief in God, but faith can, and that is outside of the boundaries of rational discourse. So yeah, maybe. But at least when we are trying to see if and whether and where there is this consistency and overlap in theistic intuition, in theological tradition, and rational powers or epistemic sort of conditions for belief and truth in general, can we make them work? And the arguments seem, again, here to be stacking up, right? Gratuitous evil, natural evil, different formulations of the problem of evil, all the objections we gave to the different theodicies. We might be satisfied by one or the other, but there's always kind of sneaking suspicion. So in a previous iteration of this class, I imposed like an incredibly hard and very long paper that I doubt anybody read. And if they did, I apologize, people of the past. But it's a fantastic paper. Like if you take a philosophy of religion class, you'll probably read it. It's super famous. It's called The Problem of Error, the Problem of Evil, Problem of Error, Problem of Silence. And it's by Peter Van Inwagen, who's a theologian, philosopher of religion, philosopher of metaphysics, logician at Notre Dame. Super famous. So Ann Peterson, no, maybe it was her husband, who Inwagen was his advisor. Can't remember. I think Ann's advisor was a different Aristotle scholar. But anyway, she worked with Inwagen quite a bit. Inwagen's a brilliant guy. He gives a theodicy called the skeptical theology, skeptical theism. So the idea is that the skeptical theist position is not so much a theodicy, I mean, like a little bit. At least it's not like the others. As it is a skeptical stance against the evidential problem of evil, like the gratuitous evil makes the existence of God unlikely. The evidential problem says that the existence of suffering, gratuitous in particular, is evidence that makes the existence of the triune God less probable. But how does the evidentialist know that suffering, gratuitous evil, and the suffering involved with it counts as evidence against God's existence? Right. So it's supposed to be this like evidential problem. You're like weighing the evidence one way or another. But in order to say that something's evidence, remember with like the teleological proof, you had to say that human artifacts are like natural objects, and it's because they're like one another that we get this degree of probability, this evidence for intelligent design, and also the idea that like effects have like causes, right? For any degree of probability, you have to have reason for saying that this is evidence for that. So if I said that the lights at the hospital campus are evidence for this being the color black, you would look at me with your eyebrow raised up to your hairline. Like, what the heck are you talking about? The lights over there have nothing to do with the color of this. I mean, maybe like if they were lighting up, but I mean, like the fact that this was colored black at all, be absurd to say that. And this is like kind of a big problem in science, is coming up with measures that actually give you evidence for the effect or the phenomena that you're trying to measure at all. And you have to make a good case if you're coming up with a new paradigm of measurement, that what you're controlling for and measuring is actually good evidence for the correlative effect, the phenomena that you want to capture. So what the skeptical theist does is they draw into skeptical scrutiny the idea that gratuitous evil, suffering, or whatever at all is actually evidence for or against God. That what makes you think that you know that this is evidence in one way or another? So as he says, while the patterns in Weigand of suffering that we find in the actual world constitute a difficulty for theism, so it's no longer the problem of evil, it's the difficulty of evil, they do not, owing to the availability of the defense I've outlined, attain to the status of evidence. It follows that the evidential argument from evil fails, for it is essential to the evidential argument that those patterns of suffering be evidence that favors atheism over theism. So what's the defense here? What's going on in this quote? God is an infinite being with infinite power. Humans are finite and often make mistakes in moral calculation. So, like Darcy and Wickham and Pride and Prejudice, if you've read this, that Darcy is this like perfect person, but he's also really proud. Or no, he's the prejudiced one. It is really, it's Liz that's proud. So, oh no, maybe she's the prejudiced one. Maybe they're both proud and prejudiced. It's been a couple of years. Anyways, Darcy is like a real jerk, right? But he doesn't mean to be. He just, like everybody around him is sort of uncouth and too emotional and not civilized and not polite and they're a bunch of brutes. And he means well. In fact, he's a pretty fantastic guy. He's always out helping everybody, but he kind of like is a snob. He like looks down on you and says, you're kind of a gross person for being that loud, And so like he's a good person, but he makes some mistakes in moral calculation and thinking that he should be so prejudiced, proud, one or the other. So if evil or good exists in the world, some of that evil in the grand scheme of things is necessary to bring about the good. There's some soul making going on. We can't tell which sort of evil is going to bring about a greater good and which suffering is just suffering for its own sake, which suffering is gratuitous. But because we can't tell the difference between the sort of suffering that's gratuitous and the sort of suffering that is overcomable and workable, being the finite things that we are, the existence of suffering cannot be said to be evidence against theism. It might turn out, after all, that the suffering we think is bad is really necessary for some ultimately perfect end. So this is a kind of way of not committing to the fact that, like, say, the Holocaust, for instance, is a necessary evil for soul making or whatever, but just that from this skeptical perspective, we don't know. We're not God. We don't have the divine omniscient vision of like what counts as ultimately good and what doesn't. We can't make that kind of calculation. We can barely decide for ourselves if it's all right to flick our friends in the back of the head every 30 seconds, right? So as these like finite, imperfect beings, how are we supposed to like be in this position to say, I am certain, I know that this suffering is evidence against the existence of God, or I know that this suffering is incontrovertible and gratuitous? We just don't have that power, that perspective. We don't have the omniscience. And so the skeptical theist says, look, I can't tell the difference between gratuitous evil and non-gratuitous evil. I don't have the principle that allows me to make a sound conclusion about one kind of suffering over another. Therefore, I can't count it as evidence for or against the existence of God. So problem of evil, maybe, but it's not so much as Inmagen says, a problem as it is a difficulty for the skeptical theist, at least. So skeptical theism withholds judgment about the existence of suffering or purpose of, and concludes that its ultimate moral worth is unknowable. Does anybody want?
Lame.
That's not an objection.
Okay.
Not bad,
I think it's lame
actually.
to say, to just kind of back away from the argument and say, well, we can't really know. I think that we, as philosophers, we should always be trying to find an answer rather than just stepping back.
Yeah, so this is skepticism is a helpful tool. It's my feeling that it is only a tool. But there are all sorts of traditions that think that like skeptical positions and even like ultimately skeptical ones are like positions of like health, that it's good for you to be that way. You get tranquilitas is the idea, where if you have no dogmatic beliefs whatsoever, you're in a position of sort of like openness and complete compassion. And this would be similar, I mean, not exactly right, but similar to the philosophy of Buddhism, and like part of it. It's way more complicated, but like similar sort of ideas that skepticism can give you a peace of mind and also like peace of community that is good for you. But we might also think that skepticism in some cases is unhelpful. You say like, I think that this remote is black, and you like a 4-year-old say why, and you say, well, I see it. And they say, why? Well, because I have eyes and they, see light. Why? Right. And you can do that forever, or you can say, well, I'm not sure about you or your eyes or the color black or anything. I don't know what anything is. It's unhelpful, right? It's just like kind of irritating even to be so skeptical, because where does it get you? If you're not seeking this like tranquility stuff, what purpose does skepticism serve? And as a tool, skepticism I think challenges us to give even better reasons to give better arguments, to come up with more complete and closer to the truth positions. Like the whole point of philosophy is like to seek the truth, right? Or like the love of wisdom is the like project of searching for truth, maybe never finding it, but searching for it at least. And skepticism is sort of like nip that in the bud, right? There's no truth out there, so like what good does searching do for us? And yeah, so we might be kind of irritated with the skepticism in that way. But again, philosophy is not just about search for truth. There's also other principles and values and virtues that we learn from it. Like, for instance, charitability. So charitably then, if there's an irritating way that skepticism can be, and there's also like the less irritating, but still kind of unhelpful for the purpose of like learning and seeking truth in general, which is let's just not be dogmatic about anything and sort of float and be great, the Pyrrhonian sort of skeptic. What could this skeptical argument do is at least break the inference of or the inference of correlation between suffering to evidence for the existence or not of God. And if this kind of argument is used as a tool, then it challenges us to be more precise about what we mean by evidence, right? Anybody else want to object to skeptical theism?
Oh yeah, the first, some of the evils necessary to bring about the good, that again doesn't seem like clear to me. I do actually like this though, not theistic, but it seems like a pretty solid. I like this one.
Yeah, so you might sort of like object to like any kind of soul making. I mean, it is at least intuitive to say that it's good to get rid of bad. And so but what Inwagon's doing here is like kind of covering his bases. Saying like, yeah, there's some not so great stuff. And we don't know like what the worse and better of it is, but at least we do know that there's a difference in the quality of kinds of events in the world. And if we're skeptical about the good ones and the bad ones, then we can at least tell the difference. And if there's a difference, then the ones that are bad that we overcome, that's all right. Anybody else? Online? No? Yeah.
It just feels like it's kind of backing away from trying to use reason to prove or disprove them. It's basically just going back to saying we should just have faith.
Yeah. So it might be a kind of return to dogmatism, that like it's not just a skeptical argument that pushes us in the direction of like, let's not worry about this issue, like, because we can't worry about it, which might be irritating, right? But it might also have the alternative effect of leading us back into a dogmatism. And if we want to be convinced by reason, if we want to use reason, then we need to be really careful with this kind of skeptical theism, because it might bite off more than we can chew, and we might end up choking on how rational we're being, committed only at this point to faith and with no way forward. So in this spirit, the like popular objection is similar. The popular objection to skeptical theism is to say, look, if we're skeptical about what counts as gratuitous suffering versus regular suffering, if we don't have this omniscient perspective of the good and the bad, oh, that includes the good too, doesn't it? Right? So not, sure, I can't say like what evil is in the world and if it's evidence for the existence of God or not. But if I'm fully committed to skeptical theism, I'm finite. I'm not omniscient. I don't have the God eye view. So I shouldn't know what good is either. What's good, what's bad? I got none of it. If I'm truly a skeptical theist, then I might be shrouding myself in a little bit too much mystery, right? And that is a big bullet to bite. It's a big commitment. It does make the problem of evil a challenge of evil, but it also at the same time makes it a challenge of moral evaluation at all. Sort of the double-edged blade of skepticism that you're talking about. Okay, that's the end. So next week we meet on Wednesday, not Thursday because it's the holiday. And don't feel, again, committed to coming. If you have family stuff to do, prioritize that. The lecture will be up on YouTube. Yeah, so have a good week. Next week we do What is Happiness? We read about flow states and like being absorbed in our activities and all sorts of like fun attention stuff. It'll be a good one. So see you then.